My name is Thomas Berlanda, and I'm a professor of architecture at the School of Architecture, Planning and Geomatics at the University of Cape Town. My main field of interest straddles notions of ground through the lens of architectural topographies and that of contemporary cities in the global south. Today, I've been invited to respond to the questions of what shock and stress would I like to speak to, and why does it matter as a contribution to ILAO, the International Laboratory of Architecture and Urban Design. And I think what I would like to spend some time discussing with you is the acknowledgement of the role that infrastructure has played in the 20th century in the construction of the current morphological conditions of most cities in the south, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, as a result of the colonial project. And I think it's useful to discuss the infrastructural legacy of that project as a really difficult barrier to any meaningful form of sustainable and resilient future, particularly in light of the current pandemics. Because if the introduction of the infrastructure was largely a means to facilitate a project of extraction by foreign powers that needed to take away from the colonies the goods for overseas markets, it also allowed the establishment of barriers, of borders, of lines, artificial and arbitrary lines that demarcate and segregate populations based on race, class, gender, creating the conditions for an unjust and unsustainable society which are really hard to break even in the post-colonial era. And this because the construction, the physical construction of the infrastructure went hand in hand with the establishment of policy frameworks that created legal justifications for for arbitrary notions such as private property, access to resources. And I think that it's important, particularly in the wake of the current health crisis, to identify the limitations and hurdles that the infrastructures have put in place, because they require alternative forms of imagination and alternative forms of geographical and spatial imaginaries to move beyond. And in a sense, the question would be how, and could ILAO, for instance, be the laboratory that tries to test and work with these issues in terms of imagining alternative futures. To give an example of a place that I've become familiar over the last few months, let's take the city of Harare, the capital city of Zimbabwe. Harare was established as Fort Salisbury at the end of the 19th century as a company town, as part of this nefarious project envisioned by Cecil Rhodes and his acolytes to look for gold and resources in what is now Zimbabwe, on the road from Cape Town to Cairo, this imperial, scary project of domination. And it's important to trace its establishment as a company town, because then the model of the company town is one that gets further refined in the early 20th century across really different foreign powers that have colonies, as one that is divided from the get-go, from a central quarter that is dedicated to Europeans, and separated them from indigenous neighborhoods by means of the infrastructure and the industrial infrastructure. And so if one understands the role of railroads as means to connect and to extract, they also obviously separate. And throughout then its urban growth, Harare, like many other cities in Africa but also elsewhere in the south, maintains this separation to this day. And if one looks at the railway yards in Harare, in central Harare, one has the opportunity to recognize the potential of this large-scale urban land, valuable, that has become almost untouched. And this, is a phenomenon that is easily to find again in places like Lagos or Nairobi or Addis Ababa, precisely because the railway stations and its yards were at the center, or Kampala, at the center of the urban fabric, but the use of the rail changed during the years and became less and less frequent. But now this land, this privileged portion of terrain that sits at the center, could be restituted to the general public rather than kept in public-private partnerships that seem to seek to maximize its real estate capital. And I say that because by imagining alternative modes of using this land would mean a contribution to undoing the colonial legacy, and also speaking to how does the public, what kind of public interest, be responded to, and what kind of futures, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, the push to find alternative modes of social integration, limit the use of car transport, and facilitate forms of interaction, profit from this lens. So in that sense, I'm speaking to the longue durée of of what is both of and off the tracks, and how can railway imaginaries contribute to dislocate established stratigraphies of power, and how this could also offset some of these specious sanitary measures of the cordon sanitaire, or these buffer zones that have been otherwise used to divide, in terms of imagining new forms of care, and not simply and no longer cure to diseases, but rather care in a society that becomes more equal, more horizontal, and hopefully more just. And I think that ultimately this restorative justice project needs to happen also as a way to challenge the urban as a static environment. And I think this is precisely also a way to challenge the modern idea that life only happens in the city and that ways of settling and inhabiting the city are permanent, rather recognizing that across cultures, across pluralities of social and cultural forms, settlements are not necessarily static, and hence again the role that the infrastructure of mobility plays in facilitating movements and ways of living that might be seasonal, that might be gender-based, that might be family structure-based, would then allow to challenge the unilateral Western canon and speak to other forms of production. They're not simply those inherent to the global project of inequality. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to future conversations.